Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcs, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 4, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today's guest is writer, academic, and documentary producer Dr. Sami Ahmad Khan. He's a recipient of several academic honors, including a Fulbright grant. Sami holds a PhD in Indian science fiction from JNU, where he also teaches today. His first novel, Jihad, won 2 literary awards, and his second novel, Aliens in Delhi, was shortlisted for 1 too. His writing has also been published in leading academic journals. His latest book, Star Warriors of the Modern Raj, was longlisted for a BSFA award. Sami and I had a long chat about our love for sci-fi, our genuine affection for pulpy, trashy stories, what got him into speculative fiction in the first place, and the inspiration behind his storytelling. Hi Sami, thank you so much for joining us today on Arcs. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Hi Anjali, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
I always start my interviews by asking this question, and I'm not sick of it yet. Could you tell us a bit about your journey as a writer? Did you always want to be one?
Well, let me take you back almost 2 or 3 decades to this small, village in Western UP. And I was visiting my grandmother. It was a very hot summer. And I remember this carpenter shop that has just sort of sprung up right opposite my grandmother's house. And I don't know why, but this carpenter started renting out comic books of all the things possible, sort of a side hustle. And so I just went there, naturally attracted by the shiny, glossy stuff. I was in grade 2 or 3, I think. I was just a very small boy. And I saw inside and I saw this really colorful stuff in Hindi, in a language I understood, in a language that was my own. And he had 10 or 15 comics. I was amazed. I was like, what is this magic? And I started browsing through it. And even before I realized, I was hooked on to this comic about space battles in Hindi in the early 90s with different looking people dressed in different spacesuits, costumes, species. And I got that book and I was like, my God, this is something I have to do with my life. And that is how, my fascination with science fiction begins. And then, cut to 2 years later, this is still the early 90s and I'm back home in Delhi and I come across another comic book shop. And I realized, boss, I'm turning into this comic book kind of person. I don't usually read stuff from school, but I could be found near that comic book store for like hours at a day. And then I came across another book. And that is something that changed my life. That is something that made me realize that, okay, I want to do this for the rest of my life. I want to write, I want to think, I want to imagine, because this was so cool. It was a book about unexplained phenomena. So it had like multiple chapters, but the 3 chapters that I remember that changed my life. One was about this apex predator, sharp jaws, sharp teeth, jaws as powerful as anything, T-Rex. And I had, again, an immediate surge of not just fascination, but fear. The second was a chapter on a black hole. That is something that still terrifies me to this day. I mean, imagine you being a class 3rd or 4th student and coming across this idea of a black hole, of a singularity, of an event horizon, and what it does to you, what it does to your body, what it does to consciousness, what it does to natural phenomena. I mean, I still wake up in the middle of the night screaming, black hole, sometimes. And the 3rd chapter, that was about the Bermuda Triangle. I realized that there are some things in this world which are worth pursuing, if not as a paranormal investigator, because that was my first supposedly, aspirational goal when I was a kid, to explain or talk about these phenomena that are all around us, these unresolved mysteries of the world, the natural world, the physical world. But then came high school, and then came non-medical, and then came physics, chemistry, and maths. And I realized in order to talk about these things, I need to be really good at all of them, which I wasn't, and I still am not. So I shifted from scientific study to science fiction. And I was like, you know what? I can't study you scientifically, but I can do thought experiments about you in my head. And that needn't be peer reviewed with the same kind of zeal. I'm also glad you asked me this question because I do not see myself as a writer. I see myself as a fan. I see myself as a reader of the genre that I love so much. And it is because of certain childhood experiences, these childhood sort of exposure to these unexplained phenomena of the world, these unresolved mysteries, the fascination, the fear, the terror, the pleasure, the vismay, of it all. That somehow comes into us as fans of the genre, of the mode, and then it just becomes the way we think. And once you start thinking from that perspective, then what you write essentially isn't just science fiction. It is about you trying to come to terms with external reality, or at least the way it appears to be, right? And then you start having fun with yourself and what you're doing.
I love the idea of describing yourself as a fan, because I think that's how we all got started with science fiction, how everyone falls in love with it as a genre. And I'm also laughing because the T-Rex was very much one of my awakenings into loving the intersection of science and storytelling, because I was the most excited child at the movie theater when Jurassic Park came out. I once saw a dinosaur skeleton in a museum and absolutely lost it. I love that we all get our origins from being fans, and I think that's a great way to kind of describe yourself. Of course, now you're not a paranormal investigator, you're a professor, and you do teach science fiction. And how did you get there? You studied English literature, I presume.
Oh, yes, this is a wonderful journey. Like everyone in my generation, I enrolled in a BTech program after my class 12th. And I did engineering for like 3 months. And then I told my family that either I was running away or I was joining a literature program. So they said, okay, fine, you do whatever you feel like doing. And I was lucky enough to get into the literature program at DU. And that is what I did for my bachelor's, because I was very sure about what I wanted to do. I wasn't looking for CTCs or packages or plush postings. I was just looking for a place where I could be allowed the opportunity and the space to just read, think, and write. And that to science fiction. So when I actually started my literature program and then I came for a master's and then PhD, everything was about enjoying what I was doing. Sometimes we become great scholars, but we lose out on the joy of reading. We lose out on the pleasure of being happy, of coming across something and reading it and being happy, and not as a scholar thinking, well, you know what, I must write a research paper on this. And that is something which I wanted to combat. All my life, I want to study science fiction. And here I am. I'm privileged and lucky enough to teach science fiction, to read science fiction, to discuss science fiction, to supervise research on science fiction. But then the best thing is that you get to read something that you always wanted to read. So yes, I am very happy there.
That's great. And I think it makes such a difference when you're working in a field that you're incredibly passionate about. I also love that it started so early for you, because you obviously fell in love with genre when you were very young and it developed from there. And I find the idea of studying it academically very interesting, mostly because I know a lot of people who want to read and write science fiction and not so many of them who want to study it. It's a field that is still kind of growing, and it hasn't really, I think, received the acknowledgement that it deserves in India. It hasn't quite been accepted as mainstream here, even though we're making progress in that direction. So what do you get out of studying it academically, as opposed to just being a fan and consuming it as a reader?
Thank you, Anjali, for that question. That's a great question. And that is one of the questions that drives my life forward. The reason why I read science fiction, write science fiction, and teach science fiction in a language I understand is because I was sick of people asking me, hey, do you have science fiction? What is science fiction? What do you do with science fiction? And once you realize that science fiction isn't really about the world as it should be, it is essentially about the world as it is. It is talking about our problems today. It talks about a world on fire. It talks about hatred consuming people. It talks about anger and violence and frustration and dystopias and authoritarian governments and clones and others and monsters and AI and zombies and God knows what else. This is our world. This is not just somebody else's world. This is not just somebody else's reality. It's what we are doing to our fellow human beings and other species today. So I thought that through a sustained study of science fiction, I can dispel the misconception that science fiction is escapist. Boss, it's not. It is so much more real than realist fiction you get out there today. And then I was also sick of people asking me, hey, do you guys have science fiction? Well, meaning that do you Indians have science fiction? And I was like, just because you do not read our languages doesn't mean that you will say that, hey, you don't have science fiction. Go learn our language. So it is kind of a political choice for me, because I want to read and teach and write Indian science fiction in India based on the Indian context so that there is a foregrounding of the genre in a certain way. But then I must also add, this genre doesn't need foregrounding. This genre has awesome people who have been writing it, trading it for a long time. Let me just go back in history. The biggest misconception is that science fiction is something which is a recent import in this country. Science fiction is something that comes to India in the 21st century. Even a cursory analysis leads to the fact that this is not true because there exists more than a century of continuous and extremely successful history of modern science fiction in India. Right? To cite examples from just 3 languages. In Hindi, you have Pandit Ambeka Dutt Vyas's Ashcharya Vritant, 1884, Babu Keshav Prasad Sundarloki Yatra, 1900, Just Don't Treat It with Hans Pfahl. Then you have, in Bangla, you have J. Ray's Shukra Brahman, 1879, Himlal Datta's Rahasya, 1886, Nirudeshar Kahani, Partak Tufan, 1896. In Indian English, we have K.C. Dutt's A Journal of 48 Hours of the year 1945, published in 1835. We have S.C. Dutt's The Republic of Orissa, published in 1845. And of course, we have Sultan Ajlim, Ruqya Sakhawat Husain's 1905, right? So this is somewhat around the same time when SF is reaching its apex in the global north, right? So SF isn't something that is a recent import to this country. SF is something that was being produced at the same time it was coming of age in other parts of the world, right? So this is the first misconception. You talk to a different set of people and they'll say, well, you know what? We always had science fiction. We had science fiction for like 5,000 years because the Brahmastas were nuclear weapons. Again, that's a great political argument, but then data doesn't really support that because it may be speculative fiction, but it may not be seen as science fiction in my perspective. And I think that the teaching and the popularization of science fiction and the mainstreaming of science fiction is required because it is a genre, it is a mode that is already in our hearts. It's just not there in the market. It's just not there in the universities, to the same degree as it is in other parts of the globe. But that does not mean that Indian science fiction doesn't exist. We have wonderful work being done in, say, Bangla, Ray, for example, Adrish Bardhan, Tamil, Sujata, Marathi, Narlekar, Phondke, Assamese, D.C. Goswami. So we have wonderful work being done in India's own languages. And that is something which we can access more through translations, right? So I just keep telling people that the need of the hour is translations. We have enough stuff out there, but it's just written in a language that we don't read. Because India is a nation of unity and diversity. We are a very polyphonic, pluralistic nation. We have 22 official languages in the 8th schedule of the Constitution. Not to mention thousands and thousands unofficial languages with speculative fiction being produced in a lot of them. So the need of the hour, I think, is translation and people coming together to work on science fiction, because I don't really agree with this assessment that we do not have science fiction, because SF is in our hearts somehow. It's a part of our speculative upbringing. And I say this categorically because I do not regard mythology or mythological stuff as science fiction or fantastical stuff as science fiction. I'm talking about science fiction that is driven by a particular scientific or quasi-scientific or alternate scientific or proto-scientific or pseudo-scientific kind of narrative. These kind of stories we always had. It's just that it may not have the same kind of creative or critical success at the market level as of now. But that doesn't mean that this genre, this mode of storytelling does not exist. And I feel myself as somebody who just wants to work for this genre. But the good part is I'm not alone. There are thousands and thousands of people like me in this country who are fans of the genre, and we are all part of one big SF fan community. And we're all doing this together. We're all in this together. There's no one person working on science fiction. It's about like climate change. One person cannot save the planet. Every single human being has to sort of come together to save the planet, right? And science fiction becomes one of the modes of saving the planet by making us realize what are we doing, not just to this planet, but to each other and other species. That is what speaks to me the most.
Absolutely. I think I resonate very much with what you say about it being a reflection of our society, because it is. And I think for eons, writers have used science fiction as a way to hold up a mirror to society and show you the warning signs of what could go wrong. I mean, I don't think anyone who's ever read Orwell would be surprised by what's happening in society today. Also, I think you make a very good point about translated fiction, because in India, I think we have a very grand tradition of speculative writing, and it's kind of echoed through the ages from our folk tales to contemporary writing. And I think, as you said, the major problem is that not everyone speaks the same language. I can't claim to speak all 22, so of course some things are out of reach for me. And I think, as you said, translated fiction should be the priority because we're not all reading on the same page in a literal way. So that's a lovely point. I think a lot of people are now doing a lot of interesting work in the field of translating science fiction. Also, I think contemporary Anglophone writers, as you mentioned, are doing a very different kind of science fiction to traditional writers of science fiction. And I think that's also an interesting way to look at the world. It's a great way to trace history and how things have changed over the years as well.
I think that's a great point, Anjali, because science fiction in the global north begins in the gutters, right? It's a pulp, popular, extremely problematic kind of storytelling about these bug-eyed monsters from outer space out to get your resources or your jobs, right? And then you have this big space gun using which you have to kill these monsters. So that is the kind of evolutionary trajectory of science fiction, usually in the global north. But when you talk about Indian Anglophone science fiction, it's the exact opposite. Because as I said, K.C. Dutt, S.C. Dutt, Rukia Sakhawat Hussain, 1835, 1845, 1905. If you read these kind of narratives, and then you take the next big leap, Amitav Ghosh in the 90s, Calcutta Chromosome, and then the next big leap, post-2000 Indian Anglophone science fiction with wonderful people like Manjula Padmanabhan, Priya Sarukai Chapadia, Vandana Singh, Anil Menon, Samit Basu. So it's the exact opposite trajectory, because if science fiction begins in the gutters, Indian Anglophone science fiction is so nuanced. It's so beautiful. It's so political and aesthetic at the same time. It's actually saying something beautiful, rather than, oh my God, let's kill this monster using this big space gun, right? And this kind of inverse imaging of science fiction is a very interesting point to note, because what is happening in, say, Anglophone world elsewhere, the kind of core that has is very different to the core that Indian Anglophone science fiction adopts. But the fact remains that Indian science fiction, again, like science fiction itself, exists in a spectrum. So this is something I tell a lot of people. If you think you love science fiction, perhaps you haven't read enough of science fiction. And if you think you hate science fiction, perhaps you haven't read enough of science fiction. Because science fiction is an absolute spectrum. You have something for the nuanced, feminist, progressive template. On the other hand, you also have something for the absolute sheer politically messed up. So it depends on who you are. It depends on who you want to read. And science fiction is this kind of magic ocean that gives you whatever you need. And that is the interesting part about science fiction, because it exists in a spectrum that evolves out of not just the genre conventions itself, like the international genre conventions, global genre conventions, but also the specificities of the market, the national imagination of that time, the cultural production of that time. It's a mixture of so many factors, people writing from different vantage points, because since we're all individuals, we can't write from the same vantage point. We all write from different vantage points. So if you write from even nearby vantage point, right? For example, two people are writing and their vantage points are almost the same, but not the same. Even in that case, think butterfly effect. Think about the hypersensitivity of a system to its initial conditions, right? So despite belonging to the same camp, you would end up writing different stuff. And that becomes all the more pronounced in the case of speculative narratives. Because in realism, there's still a certain sort of cogency at play, but with speculative fiction, you can do whatever you want. You can talk about dinosaurs in your college canteen killing people. You can write about zombies in the mall. You can do whatever the hell you want to do. And that is, I think, the beauty of this particular genre.
Absolutely. And I think there's different vantage points from which people write, but also different vantage points from people reading, because it's always amazing to me that I can read a book and come away with a completely different interpretation from someone else. And I'm always shocked when I hear that some particularly terrible billionaire has read a novel that I loved as a teenager, and they've come away with, I want to create a killer AI. And I'm just like, what?
Absolutely. Just to give you another example, think kaijus, right? Think these monsters from interdimensional space, or these big, huge, massive monsters full of toxic blood, radiating toxicity wherever they go. In some of these narratives, kaijus are good, In some of them, they are bad. In some of them, they are neutral. They are just forces of nature, right? So while, of course, we can read a kaiju as being good or bad or neutral, there are some narratives which lend a particular reading more credence, right? So absolutely, reading specifically about science fiction is very fascinating because you think, or the filmmakers or the writers think that they are sending a certain message, but then that message could be tongue in cheek. It might be easily subverted, or it might be the exact opposite of what they're trying to say. And that is our power as sort of readers and viewers and listeners, that this is a genre that doesn't exist in a tangible form, right? Because it is science fiction. We create it in our heads. We co-create stories. We co-write stories. And this is a fan genre, right? Think about conventions. Think about fandoms. So while, of course, you can make this argument that no story belongs to the author, Roland Barthes, the idea of the author being dead. But then in the case of science fiction specifically, no story belongs to the author, and it shouldn't. Neruda once said that poetry belongs to those who need it. Similarly, science fiction belongs to those who need it. You take it, and then you read it in a way that you want to read in order to survive the horrors of modern contemporary existence, right? So this is literally our opium of the masses, but this is an opium that helps us realize that we are being oppressed and we must do what needs to be done to ensure an equitable, fair, and just world. This is a genre that makes you realize that tomorrow should exist, because based on the way we are going, tomorrow might not exist. It may be a bad tomorrow, but you have to work towards the fact that tomorrow should exist. So when I read science fiction and when I write on science fiction, I understand somewhat, or some of the nuances, the political nuances, the social nuances, the economic nuances, the cultural nuances, the world building, the language, the behavior. I do not claim to understand all of it because I don't want to, and I can't. And I'm okay with that kind of limitation, right? But at the same time, there's a sheer joy in this world building, in creating these tomorrows, which we co-create with fandom communities, with the authors, with the editors, with the translators, with the other people involved in the overall process. And it is absolutely fascinating and fun. No other genre is as fun. This is the most fun genre ever created in the history of humankind. But then I'm biased, and it's okay. I'm happy being biased. I'm a fan. That's it.
If you're biased, then I'm right there with you. I totally get it. But to bring it back to what you said about how the genre got started in the West, I found that very interesting because you're right. I think that's also why people don't take science fiction that seriously, because the origins of it, for most people, outside of nuanced, interesting literature, the origins of it are in pulp fiction. I wanted to ask, did that affect your writing? Because you've written two great novels, read Jihad and Aliens in Delhi. Do you think you leaned into pulp a bit while you were doing your writing, since you're a fan of it?
I didn't merely lean into pulp, Anjali. I drowned in it, because that is something which speaks to me the most. Pulp speaks to me in a way that no other kind of narrative speaks. So I was in the process of writing my PhD on Indian Anglophone science fiction writers, 21st century. And I realized that these guys are so good. They're so aesthetic, so layered, so dense, so political, you could drown in their worlds. They're so beautiful. And then I asked myself, where is that absolutely messed up, pulpy, politically incorrect, weird, shallow writing that characterizes the origins of this genre? So I started writing to have fun. To be honest, I was in the middle of my PhD and I was half delirious. So I was like, you know what? Let me play with the idea of the genre itself. Let me play with the idea of the market itself. Let me play with otherization, political ideologies. And I thought, I'm going to write about a future war. I'm going to write about future anti-submarine weapons. I'm going to write about weapons in space. And everybody told me, specifically the publishers, what the hell is wrong with you, boss? You're in a college. Write a campus romance. That is what sells. And I was like, boss, I'm writing for myself. I'm just trying to have fun with myself. If you think it's appropriate, you publish it. If not, let it be. But I'm not going to write for you. I'm going to write for myself. So That is how my first came into being, where I was, talking about the different kinds of political ideologies and how they intersect and how they interweave and how that sort of affects international relations. And I was very sure that I'm going to take a particular genre convention. I'm going to fuse, say, future war with the political thriller, with science fiction, but I'm not going to really have characters. If genre fiction is about genre conventions, let me have a certain set of characters and let me just make them subservient to the very idea of war and violence and death itself. So rather than having these individually fleshed out characters, you have war and violence as death as the ultimate mega character that sort of has its talents in all of these characters, right? This was part of a larger thought experiment that I am in the process of conducting. Do genres make characters or do characters make genres? So my first, as I said, was a future war. And then I said, okay, I'm going to take the same characters now. I'm going to write a quasi standalone sequel. And I'm going to take these characters from, say, a future war and political thriller and put them in an alien invasion novel, which is my second novel, Aliens in Delhi. And I'm going to ask myself, do these characters change? If yes, how do they change? Why do they change? What about genre conventions, the expectations of the genre, the modes of storytelling, the overall perspective? And that is why Aliens in Delhi came into being. Aliens in Delhi is important because I was absolutely sick of not being invaded. I mean, every other country is being invaded. US is being invaded. China is being invaded. Russia is being invaded. UK is being invaded. Are we not enough for your bloody invasion? I was so angry. I was like, you know what? Aliens in Delhi is going to talk about an Indian invasion. And how would India respond? What about the bureaucracy, the military, civil society, scientists? How are they going to respond to an alien invasion while using extremely pulp narratives? I'm going to take a genre convention and I'm going to play with the entire idea of otherization, alien invasion, hate, what technologies can do to exacerbate already existing problems in our society. And how do you take a very prima facie idea of alien invasion, first contact, alien invasion novel, and subvert the very foundations, right? So this is something that really speaks to me. It gives me the kicks that you take a particular setup, you take a genre, and then you dissect it, you reverse engineer it to say something slightly different. It shouldn't be radically different. If it is radically different, it's a whole new ballgame, right? But if it is slightly different, when you read it, you're like, I know what this means. And then you're like, hang on, what? Right? So that kind of is something that is something I truly enjoy doing, that you take a particular existing structure and then you just change one particular strand within that structure and see how that structure implodes, explodes, stabilizes, destabilizes. So that's what I wanted to do with genres and genre conventions itself. But then my recent writing is suddenly also becoming slightly more angry. I don't know why, but I do know why. It's becoming angrier because I read the newspaper. And anybody who reads the newspaper and isn't angry in this world, I think lacks empathy, for the lack of a better word, And I say this often, that I came to science fiction for the wonder that the cosmos had to offer, but I stayed back for the genocide.
I'm not surprised at how angry you are, because I think that if you come looking for wonder and you see genocide, that would make anyone furious.
Right, because see, science fiction was supposed to be the best of us, but it became the worst of us. And that is why this genre, which has so much potential, can either lead us to a nuclear bomb, it can lead us to a mushroom cloud, but at the same time, it can also lead us to other worlds, other peoples, other species with whom we can communicate as equals and live, as the Vulcans say, infinite diversity and infinite combination, right? So we can do that. So it depends on what kind of science fiction wolf you plan to feed.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you also have a pretty unique perspective because you're teaching a whole new cohort of science fiction lovers now. So you get a front row seat into what the masses are going to be in a couple of years, the people buying the books and writing the books. And how has that changed you as a writer, as a consumer of science fiction?
It just makes me immensely happy, because I realized a long time ago that everybody is happy teaching their own kinds of science fiction at their level. So in terms of, say, the nation state alone, The British are happy teaching Anglophone science fiction. The Australians are teaching Australian science fiction. The French are happy teaching French science fiction, in addition to global science fiction, of course, right? But who's teaching Indian science fiction? We may have some courses on, say, global science fiction, but shouldn't we be also talking about Indian science fiction, which, as we talked about, has a rich history? It is written across so many languages. It is so topical. It is relevant. It is aesthetic. Some of it is political. Some of it is fascinating. So it exists as per the exact spectrum that we were talking about. Why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we teaching this? Why aren't we researching on this? Right? So, and this is why I feel very privileged that my university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India, gives me the freedom to offer courses in Indian and global science fiction at the MA and PhD level. It has been a learning experience for me because these extremely bright students of MA and PhD, when they start writing, you realize this is amazing. This is fascinating. There's a whole new generation of science fiction, not just readers, but writers, editors, translators, filmmakers who are out there. So it's kind of passing on the mantle to better, wiser, and more intelligent minds. My life has one purpose, and that purpose is to somehow popularize Indian science fiction in India and the world. That is the thing that drives me. And for that, if I have to write science fiction, I will. If I have to translate science fiction, if I have to do anything about Indian science fiction, I'll do it happily because I consider this a calling. And somehow I'm lucky enough at this point that I have been given the opportunity to actually execute. And I'm doing that. And let me tell you one thing categorically, the next generation at universities and schools and colleges, they are absolutely fantastic. They are better than I am. They are wiser. They write better. They think better. They are smarter. So I think Indian science fiction is in great hands from that perspective.
It gives me such a sense of happiness knowing that there are more people coming who are going to add to this long legacy of Indian science fiction, and hopefully not just Anglophone science fiction. Because as you said, I think we've really underappreciated science fiction written in other languages. And I really hope that we see more of that as well.
Absolutely. We must understand that Indian Anglophone science fiction exists. It's great. But this doesn't represent the totality of science fiction in this country. Because fascinating work, wonderful work is being done in other Indian languages. And we must see that too. Just because I cannot read Marathi, for example, doesn't give me the right to say that okay, science fiction only exists in the language that I am more comfortable with. This is something which we are trying to fight. I mean, the science fiction fan community in this country. There's this lovely book, 90s, It Happened Tomorrow, edited by Bal Phonke, which translated a lot of stories from India's regional languages into English. And then similarly, you have the 2 Gollancz volumes, which contain some translations. And then you have magazines like Kalpa Bishwa, based in Calcutta, who are kind of translating stuff from Bangla to English and English to Bangla. So good work is being done. And I just feel good about the future somehow, which is something which science fiction people usually would not say, because we do not feel good about the worlds to come. But we feel good about the actual, tangible, extrapolatable worlds to come, at least when it comes to writing and reading science fiction.
I like that disclaimer. I wanted to ask, before I let you go, can you tell us a bit about any upcoming work, anything that people should look out for?
Right. So I think I have reached that stage in my life where I've realized that I must write science fiction because it makes me happy. But I also must write on science fiction so that we take our science fiction to a global audience. So my last book, which came out, it's an academic book co-edited with Marve Tabar. It's about imaginations or speculative fictions across the global South, South Asia, Southwest Asia, North Africa, specific countries. So we reached out to writers and scholars from these locations. And we asked the writers to write about how they imagine futures, what tinges their science fiction. So basically think pieces. And then we asked the scholars to write scholarly and academic articles about science fiction from that region. And then we put them together. We transpose them together to know more about these speculative imaginations from across these locations. And then my next book is a critical annotated version of one of the novels of J.N. Vishnu Narlekar, specifically meant for a global audience because JVN has done wonderful work, not just for the Indian scientific community, but also science fiction community. So he popularized science, he communicated science, he kind of fought against superstitions. We grew up reading him. His stories were there in the NCERT syllabus. I think the comet was there, the adventure was there, alien hand was there. Right. So the next book is on J.V. Narlikar to tell the world that, look, this is our science fiction tradition. This is what we do, and read more about it.
Thank you so much for being on ARCS today, Sami. It was such a pleasure catching up with you, and you've really given me a kind of an education on Indian sci-fi. I've got a long list of things to look up now, and thanks again for being here.
It is my pleasure, Anjali. It was wonderful talking to you, and as always, keep up the great work with ARCS.
ARCS is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and notes.